Welcome to the Work Smarter, Not Harder Rewind podcast. I am Brittany Alligood.
And I'm Scott Holcomb.
And we're a part of the program accountability team in the Data Research and Accountability Department here at Wake County Public Schools. And as the newest members of the team, we've been taking a look back at our earlier episodes to shine a light on how our department has been helping staff navigate the self-monitoring process.
And today's episode will wrap up our two-part Rewind series finale. We'll be covering 4 more types of data stories in our work with a look back of examples and what-if scenarios from our Rewind interviews. We want to ensure these data stories are clear and meaningful rather than getting lost in the numbers in a spreadsheet.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to getting more into those data stories like we did last time. So in our last episode, we explored 4 different types of data stories. And again, like Scott just mentioned, we provided examples from our colleagues' interviews with program staff to show all the different types of data that they discussed and how that could be used to tell a story about their own work.
And in this episode, we're continuing our conversation to help you address how to use data visuals to make sure data stories are clear and meaningful rather than, again, just getting lost in those numbers. And just like in our last episode, much of the content that we'll cover and language we'll use in this episode comes from Stephanie Evergreen's great book titled Effective Data Visualization. Each chapter walks through a different type of data story and shows how to choose the right chart, often using Excel.
And again, we can leave the link to that book in the show notes for anyone who wants to check that out.
Yes. And Brittany, as a reminder, what were the 4 data stories we covered in our last episode?
Yeah, so last time we talked about different types of data stories surrounding a single number, looking at comparisons, benchmarks or reference points, and then parts of a whole. So what do we have in store for today's episode, Scott?
So we're going to be branching out. Each of those examples of data stories were great at showing you a snapshot of your data at a single point in time, but they don't always show you the full trajectory of your work. So that brings us to our first data story today, which is telling a story about how things change over time. And this is something that's essential when you want to track or monitor data to see how things did or even didn't change from something you implemented within your program.
Yeah, we're very familiar with this. We see this all the time in program accountability, especially when something is new or just being rolled out, whether that's rolled out over a school year or over a few years, a few months, whatever the time period is. And we want to know if we're seeing the improvements that we hope to see over that period of time. And so we're really asking not only did it work, but is it working better over time?
And to see how this looks in practice with an example from one of our earlier conversations with Crystal Cabral, who at the time was a K-5 math coordinating teacher, she explained why looking at data over time helps us avoid tunnel vision and gives a much fuller picture of, in her example, student success rather than a single proficiency score.
Yeah, so let's play the clip of her talking about the importance of student growth percentiles and, again, how we can measure that over time.
When students take that assessment, we're provided a proficiency score. And that's important because it tells us how likely a student is to be proficient at their grade level content at the end of the year. But an equally important data point is how students are growing compared to their like peers. So when we're looking at a proficiency data point, say for a 3rd grader, it's going to tell us across all other 3rd graders, how did I do compared to all those other 3rd graders across the nation? But when we're thinking about the idea of the big picture, we also want to know how did a 3rd grader who performed like me grow compared to how I grew. So there's another type of data we always run along with our proficiency data called student growth percentile. And what student growth percentile tells us is this idea that if I'm a 3rd grader who's performing at, say, the 50th percentile, how did I grow between benchmark windows compared to other 3rd graders who are also performing in the 50th percentile? And that data is important because sometimes in a school, we can get really tunnel vision. And it's like, who made it, who didn't, who was proficient, who wasn't. But what if I have a bunch of students who are proficient, but they're not growing? I need to know that part of the story too. And so we try to link data points together that give us a fuller picture of what might be happening across a school and a classroom.
So again, that was Crystal talking about how we can see student growth across time and make those comparisons. And then the second clip from Crystal that we wanted to play shows her talking about Dreambox and gives another example where we can see those changes across time.
Dreambox has a student overview graph that updates in real time, and that's going to tell us by domain how proficient students are. And that one, actually, teachers really love that display because it's adaptable by time frame. So I can say, I want to see how the students grew in the last year, or I want to see how students grew the last 2 years, or I want to see how my students grew the last month. So you can go in and live time update what time frame you're working in, and that will change the way the data looks.
Again, it was interesting to hear Crystal talk about tunnel vision that we can sometimes get if we're just looking at proficiency data. So by telling a story about how things change over time, we can see if students are actually making progress relative to where they started rather than just focusing on where they ended up.
Yeah, definitely. And then in that second clip, the Dreambox example that she provided really highlights the power of data visualization, of being able to adjust those time frames based on what questions you want answered. I know in her further conversation, she talked a lot about being able to be flexible in the moment and being able to have that flexibility, especially for teachers, to see students' growth over a month or a few months or a year or whatever the time frame is that they are interested in. That can really help teachers make active decisions in the moment and then adjust their strategies or things that they can change to help that student further grow. But as both of us know very well, not all data stories are always told with numbers.
Yes, and that brings us to our next data story, telling a story with words. And this is where we look at qualitative data, which often helps us understand the why behind our numerical data we collect.
Yeah, and this can include a lot of things. It can include interviews, also informal conversations about people's experiences or their thoughts, and also open-ended survey questions where people can write like a free response to a question. So as an example for this, let's go back to episode 1 to hear Granville talk about how he used words to tell a story about how his program was working. And in his case, he was using checklists and anecdotes.
As I said before, because a lot of what I was doing was very simple. It was basically checking off whether this piece was in place or that piece was in place. But I also use a lot of anecdotal data. I would get comments from mentors during formal and informal gatherings. I would get information from emails. They would tell me what was working, what wasn't working. And also I would visit children during some of the mentoring cohorts to just sort of observe how they were moving through the program. Were they enjoying it? Were they engaged with it? How the mentors were feeling? And that became a large part of what was really important to help me figure out how to move forward.
And Granville's approach is a great reminder that those anecdotes, like the emails and conversations he was having with staff members, or just observing the student engagement in his program, that's just as important as the data you receive on a spreadsheet. And in Stephanie Evergreen's book, she talks about how to create visuals with this type of data, things like word clouds, or even just counts with themes, or sometimes just quotes that you can pull. So those are examples that she provides.
Yeah, I love that point of going, not just thinking traditionally what we consider qualitative data, but moving beyond to all these different types of things like actively listening and observing and really being able to pay attention to those patterns in real time.
Yeah, and it can be a formal data collection process. It doesn't have to be, and his examples weren't, but it can be something that, that just gives you information about how you're monitoring your program and how to move forward.
Right. So speaking of going back to that more formal type of qualitative data collection, one really common way that we see these words turned into something more structured is through a survey. So this can include rating, so rating something in terms of your agreement with it, whether it's a check all that apply, where you're checking all the options that apply to you, or ranking preferences, so putting things in order of how you would prefer them. And we've all encountered surveys before, whether it's, when you get some sort of service done or shop somewhere and you get that customer satisfaction survey sent to your email, or whether it's you're attending a meeting or a conference and they're asking you what your food preferences are for the meals that they're going to prepare, whatever that might be. You've definitely encountered surveys before. And whether it's a simple example or a complex example, these are all types of survey data. And so in this episode, with Granville, Dina provided a brief summary of who Granville was hearing from in his surveys. And then Granville shared how he was able to use that survey data to improve the support he was giving to his mentors.
And it also sounds to me that as Granville was collecting data, he was trying to collect data from all participants, who we usually call stakeholders.
Exactly. When we were putting together the survey, it was also important how I structured the questions. Like, for instance, I wanted to get information from the mentors about what was needed to better support the students, what was needed to better support the mentors. And I thought that by asking about the kids first, it would help the mentors think more critically about what they need to support the kids.
I really love how he focused on the structure of his survey questions to help his mentors think critically about their work. And I remember in another part of his interview, him talking about the importance of structuring his questions in a way to elicit the information that he was hoping to get out to inform his program.
Yeah, I like that too, that dual purpose of getting feedback from his mentors about how the program is going, but also giving them that space to reflect on the mentorship that they're providing and ways that they could improve. I think it's also important because it also keeps in mind the participants' experience while they're completing the survey. So you're making sure you're valuing their time and being thoughtful in the questions that you're asking and not just asking things just to ask them or asking things that aren't relevant or things that they won't find meaning in. And I think when you have that thoughtfulness and mindfulness in your questions, people are going to be way more likely to respond and also respond meaningfully.
And we saw that in Dr. Maria Rosa Rangel's work, where she took the responses that she got from parents and families and immediately informed some program decisions based on those results. And this came from episode 4, where she discussed using pre and post surveys to help measure the impact of her program.
And one of the things that we learned by, again, reaching out to the data research and accountability is that for next school year, we need to add a post survey. And then also add so we're going to add the pre-surveys and then the post-survey so that we could then get more solid data to really focus on are we really making an impact in supporting the parents with the academic tools that they need to be able to support the achievement of their student or their children at home.
And it's powerful to see how surveys can move beyond just gathering opinions. When programs use things like a pre and a post survey, they can measure the actual real world impact of the support they're providing to their students and families.
Yeah, and back to the point I just mentioned about being mindful and intentional with your survey questions, I love that she's actually using that data to make a change and make improvements because, you don't want to take your participants' time or people's time and then not use that data. So I love that she's actually using that data in real time to make those decisions. And I'm sure people appreciate that she was doing that as well. So this leads into our final data story where we could tell a story about correlations and regressions. And this can sound very technical, which it definitely can be intimidating for people who may not have, training in research or statistics. But ultimately, it's just about understanding the relationships between variables and how one thing might be connected to another. And so Dr. Rangel also gave us a great hypothetical possibility to consider for this type of data on correlations and regressions when she was looking at the training format and parent engagement for her workshops that she was conducting.
So we want to make sure that we reach parents whichever way they want. In fact, one of the questions in the survey was, how would you like to attend family academies, face-to-face, virtually, hybrid, and interesting, a high percentage of parents, English and Spanish speaking parents, because that's who we survey, they both agreed and said that they would like to attend virtually. And then after that, it was face-to-face, but they really want the virtual family academies.
Her example was a great example of a what-if scenario. So if the program had only been offered face-to-face, she might have seen lower attendance at those events. By relating that parental survey preference data with her event planning, her staff could meet stakeholders where they were, ensuring that higher engagement and just a better resource allocation.
Right. So again, even though hearing regression or correlation might seem a little intimidating, at a simple level, it's ultimately just showing us what things go well together and what might matter more than we think. So again, Maria Rosa being able to see which format for her workshop might be associated with a higher attendance. So across all these data stories that we covered in the first episode and the second episode, whether it was words or looking at conducting surveys or tracking growth over time or looking at our goals, regardless of whatever data story that we're looking at, ultimately we want to provide a fuller picture of what's happening across our schools and programs. And again, there's all these possibilities of data stories that you can consider for your work.
And the goal of all these story types is clarity. So really helping the audience understand the so what of the information that you're collecting.
Right.
And Brittany, what stood out to you in this final episode?
I think I love seeing all the variety of things that people are doing to collect data on their programs, whether it be Maria Rosa looking at social media engagement to see what things people are engaging with more, whether it be Crystal looking at some of those more traditional data points like student growth or scores on EOCs, or Granville looking at emails and anecdotes from people in his program. I love seeing all the different types of data stories that we see within this work and seeing that it's really working for people in their specific circumstances. So there's definitely plenty of data to go around and plenty of data points to look at. So what's something that stood out for you, Scott?
I think the intentionality and just that thoughtfulness that all of those examples, you know, whether it was like you mentioned, Dr. Maria Rosa Rangel collecting something and immediately putting it to work because she realized this is what the parents are saying, so I should act on that, to Granville being thoughtful about the way he's asking questions to get his mentors to think and also to get the information he wanted. And then with Crystal, I think maybe this gets into her episode a little bit more, but her just being prepared and intentional with the data and knowing what options she has with the data she's collected.
Yeah, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's very individualized based on what their program is, what they need from it, what goal they're looking at, which, again, is something that we want to emphasize, that everyone's journey through self-monitoring looks different, and that's perfectly fine and expected. So,
yeah, and so what can our listeners look forward to next?
So this, again, wraps up our Rewind series. And we'll be back with a short bonus episode just to reflect on what we've learned from revisiting these interviews with program staff and our topic on data storytelling. And then after that, we're going to take a break for the summer and then return in the fall with a new series focused on creating data visualizations using the tools that we already have at our disposal.
Nice. And thanks to our guests from the episodes we highlighted in this Rewind episode, and all the former and current DRA colleagues who facilitated those interviews.
Thank you to our talented producer, Daniel Bunce, and to my co-host, Scott Holcomb.
Yes, thank you, Brittany, and thank you to WCPSS student Sasha Wilson from Millbrook High School for providing our theme music for this season.